Whoever welcomes this child welcomes me, says Jesus. And elsewhere in the gospel, whoever is humble, like this child, is first in the kingdom of heaven. And elsewhere in the gospels, unless you become like this child, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. I've been thinking a bunch this week about Jesus' praise of childishness, the closeness of childishness to the kingdom, and what that might mean. What does it mean to become childlike people and therefore kingdom people? Now, there's maybe some kind of prefabricated answers we could reach for in answer to that question, some sentimental or cliched answers that we could reach for. To become like a child is to be innocent, and there's probably some truth to that, but that doesn't feel like a particularly interesting answer. If we were public figures giving a speech, we might say that children are the future, and that's why Jesus is talking about children. But I've never really loved that turn of phrase because, well, I certainly hope that my children outlive me. I hope they have a vibrant future. That phrase always feels to me like it implies that children are not the present. And I want to insist that children are the present. Who they are matters right now. And if it was maybe a generation or two ago, we might say that to be childlike means to be seen and not heard. So if you want to get into the kingdom, don't talk too much. I have three different wonderings than those prefabricated ones for us this morning. I don't know if they're better, but they're the ones that I'm sitting with today. You may have your own wonderings, and I'd like to share them with you. So first, I want to suggest that to be childlike means to be willing to learn and to be okay with looking absurd while you do so. One of the big barriers to me to learning as an adult is my desire to look very competent. I desire to look knowledgeable and in control. And it's been a real barrier for me in things like learning another language. I'm worried about being embarrassed, about using the wrong gender to refer to some word or the wrong tense or the wrong word entirely. I'm going to look foolish, and that is hard for me to risk. It wasn't always that way for me, though. My mother tells this story about visiting Germany when I was a very small child, so small that this experience is at the fringes of my memory, and that not very long into the trip, I began to babble, but to babble in German. So to make sounds that were coherent with the accent and the rules of that language. I was completely okay with being awkward. I was completely okay with being wrong. My brother-in-law, who as an adult has learned a great many languages, has completely embraced this. He says that if he doesn't know a word, he'll just choose an arbitrary word and swap it in instead. So if he wants to sit in down here and he doesn't know the word for it, he will say, "I'm going to sit in the fork." And what he's discovered is that the people around him, the native speakers around him, automatically volunteer the right word at that point. They say, "Oh yeah, we call that a pew." And then he learns and knows, but there's this willingness. He's okay with being silly. And I think that for grown-ups is a very difficult thing to do indeed. Most of us can't take that risk of appearing out of control, of appearing uncertain. I don't know who it was who observed that if you ask a group of kindergarten students, a class of kindergarten students, who here is an artist, that every hand in the room will go up. And that when you then repeat the same experiment with students in grade 7, It's now fewer than half of the hands that go up, and I suspect if we were to do the same experiment with adults, still fewer hands would go up. Relatively few of us would self-identify as artists. What happens between age 5 and now that we were artists then, but we aren't artists anymore? I mean, some of it is aptitude, right? You discover you're good at a particular thing, whether it's drawing or sports or math or music, and you practice. That ongoing practice is certainly how a friend of ours became a graphic novelist. He kept doing it, and other people did not. But even more than that, the kindergarten student has this willingness to just try. To just pick up the crayon or the piece of charcoal or the watercolors or whatever, the clay, and make something. Generally speaking, almost everyone in the class participates in creating something, and it's fine if it's awkward. I don't know how much I even thought at age 5 about whether or not I was going to make something awkward. I was just delighted to experiment with the charcoal. So what if to enter into the kingdom of heaven is to be willing to be an awkward learner, to seek out knowledge and just be okay with being off balance or uncertain. I'm always sorry when folks, one of the reasons that folks stay away from church they will give is they'll say, well, I don't know what I believe. And you know what? A lot of days I don't know what I believe. Like, I nod in agreement every time St. Paul says, I believe, help my unbelief. But I'm here anyway, engaging in awkward learning with you and growing through that. I'm grateful for that. So one possibility of how we might be invited into the kingdom. A second one, a way of being like a child. And so I asked Phoebe this week, I asked my spouse this week, like, what is sort of a defining characteristic of a child? And she answered immediately, a child is willing to play without any goal or designated outcome. And I'd never actually thought of phrasing it that way before, but the instant Phoebe said that, I said, that's entirely correct. I was thinking back to some of my happiest memories of playing as a child, like flow experiences on the playground, where time is moving variously much faster or much slower than what the clock says. Someone calls you for dinner and you can't believe it's 5 p.m. already, like the afternoon flew by in this time of creativity. And it never occurred to any of my friends to say, okay, so before we start playing Capture the Flag, I want us to discuss the measurable outcomes that we are going to get from this experience. That would be absurd to do that. You'd be a killjoy to ask a question like that. We played because it was joyful. And I mean, sure, a researcher could look at what we were doing and say we were learning things. We were developing our motor skills, and we were developing social skills, and we were, who knows what else. But none of us named that. The reason for play was play. It's much as virtue is its own reward, play is its own reward. Back in my days in the performing arts, I always felt bad for my colleagues in administration who had to stand up and explain why people should give money to the arts organization. I suppose this is sort of a comeuppance for me, because now I stand up and explain why you should give money to the church. I always felt bad for them. They had to make these arguments to whatever body. And the argument they would often make was a pretty good argument. It went something like, for every $1 you invest in the arts, there's $9 in economic activity that flow out of it. So there's people employed by the arts organization. The folks who come to the show, in addition to buying the ticket, will go out for dinner and spend money at a restaurant. And they'll hire a taxi cab or an Uber in order to get to the the show, and they may hire a babysitter, and if it's a fancy show, they might buy a new outfit to wear. So there's all of this economic spin-off that happens. That's a fine argument, but I was always longing for my colleagues to say, you should invest in the arts because they're gloriously purposeless. You should invest in the arts because they're beautiful. And the creation of beauty, the engaging in play, we actually call a theater show a play, don't we? Sits at the core of what it is to be human. Something that's just creative, like God is in the creativity business. That's one of the first things we learn in the book of Genesis. We're imitating God when we create stuff. We are doing something deeply human and deeply divine at once, and that matters. Last time I was at the Japanese gardens here in Portland, I went and looked at the, do they call it the rock garden? The raked circles in the, I just stood there for a while in quiet looking at this. It was so glorious. And I had a very similar thought. I thought I love that this doesn't have a function. I love that it's not productive. I love that there's no thing it's doing. It's not a machine that is cranking out anything. Its purpose is to be lovely, and that matters. So maybe here's a remembrance for us. As adults, we have a team-building exercise in the hopes of generating outcomes for the team. We jog in the hopes of improving our cardiovascular health or forestalling a heart attack, instead of just for the joy of running. What if to be like a child, to enter the kingdom of God, is to say yes to beauty because it's beautiful, to play because it's wonderful to play? What would it mean if this were a holy and playful church? Okay, one more. To be like a child is to, okay, I have to remember what the third thing was here. With learning and awkwardness, the joy of play. Oh, okay, came back to me. I don't know what I was going to do if it didn't come back there. It was just, sometimes that if you have a Macintosh, that spinning beach ball just shows up. That was actually in my vision for a second there, but then it loaded and it was fine. To be a child is to be willing to ask that dangerous and holy question, why? And why is a question that leads us into moral clarity, and it's also a question that leads us into holiness, into an openness to miracle. It leads us into moral clarity because there are few or no things which for a child are obvious. For a grown-up, we may just say this is just how the world is. But a child will not say such a thing. A child will want to know why something is the way that it is. I've read quite a few children's books, and I'm struck. One of the go-to locations in a children's book is a farm. And almost always the farm is an old school mom and pop farm. So there's There's a cow, there's a sheep, there's a goat, there's a hen, and they interact in some way, and there's hilarity with the farmer, right? This is a children's story. You can correct me if I'm mistaken, but as far as I know, no one has ever written a children's book about a factory farm. No one has ever written a children's book about a hen named Harriet that lives along with 100,000 other hens and is fed via a conveyor belt, and she produces eggs in this mass production. why don't we tell that story to children? My hunch is that that is a story that would struggle to answer a child's why. Like, why are we doing that? Why is it like that? As an adult, we can talk about spreadsheets and we can talk about efficiencies and economies of scale, but that's a harder story to tell to a child. The storybook feels like something very similar. I remember years ago, a hockey player, I'm from Canada, so I have to bring up hockey periodically. A hockey player had punched out another hockey player and knocked him out. And I remember so vividly him saying after the game, "I'm glad my son is too young. I'm glad, therefore, I don't have to explain to him what I did." He understood that he would be unable to answer his son's why. For his teammates, he could say things like, "I'm a team player, and I'm fired up, and I'm a fierce competitor," right? Or other ways that we explain why violence is an important part of sports. But he'd be unable to explain that to a 4-year-old. Right? There's some moral clarity in that why. There's also in why this openness to wonder, to another world, to joyful possibility. I think it's Frederick Buechner who said that if you tell a child that there's a pot of gold under a rainbow, the child may doubt you, but they'll also go look for themselves. And there's something wonderful about that openness to possibility. Maybe there is a world where miracle is possible, where things beyond which what we can name and quantify are possible. I have the privilege of spending time with people who are dying, and as do some of you, and fairly often I will hear that the dying person has been visited by someone who died 5 years beforehand, or 10 or 20 years beforehand. The people who love them are coming to see them and spending time with them. And for us moderns, for us who live after the Enlightenment, we may hear about stuff like that and want to kind of dismiss it and say, well, that's a trick of the imagination of the dying person, or just be baffled by it. It seems to me for our ancestors, they would have said, of course, when you're dying, the people who love you come visit you and get you ready for the journey. And maybe the child would say something similar. Of course, Grandpa is coming to see you. Of course, your deceased brother is coming to see you. They love you, and they want to get you ready to go back home. I was, when I first came to faith, I was really shaped by the writing of John Shelby Spong. He was important to me in figuring out that something other than fundamentalism existed in Christianity. But as I got deeper into faith, I found Spong harder and harder because he was so grown up. He was so fundamentally foreclosed to the possibility of miracle. And Spong would write things like, he would write about the birth story of Jesus or the resurrection and say things like that don't happen. And then sort of act like he just won an argument, right? Like he just, and that's always struck me as just so, I'm just repeating myself now, but so shut down to wonder, so shut down to possibility, so shut down to the imagination. What if there is more going on in this world than we can measure or weigh or quantify? And to be a child is to be open to that. So three possibilities. And you may have your own additions to this. This is not an exhaustive list. I'd love to hear if you have your own ideas of what you might add. But 3 things that Jesus might mean when he says, you need to become humble like this child. You need to welcome this child. If you're going to get into the kingdom of heaven, you need to be this child. What if this was a church that was okay with learning and looking silly as we did so? What if this was a church that engaged in play just because play is holy and wonderful? And what if this was a church that asked that dangerous and holy question, why? Is it possible that being childlike that might indeed invite us closer to Jesus, might indeed invite us further into the kingdom of heaven?